Alaska. Most of the bear species in the world have declined substantially over the last couple hundred years, and a number of them are listed as threatened or endangered. In fact, the brown bear in the lower 48 is listed as threatened. But we're very fortunate in Alaska that we have robust, abundant populations of bears, and of course that's related to habitat. And as you recall, in the very first session, I talked about how unique Alaska was in terms of having all these public lands and really vast, intact habitats. And that's what bears need. So let's go ahead for the next slide. Okay, Alaska's habitat diversity from the Arctic pack ice, which is the background there, to the North Slope and the Arctic tundra, the boreal forest, down to the temperate rainforest. Alaska's got some amazing habitats, ecosystems that are still intact. And let's go to the next. So let's talk a little bit about the distribution of Alaska bears. I'll talk first about brown bears. They're the most widely distributed bear in the state. And it's the purple area, from the Alaska coastline, all the way around the coastline, down the Alaska Peninsula, out to Unimak Island, Kodiak Island, Kenai Peninsula, all the way down to southeast mainland. And brown bears also occur on the outer islands of Prince William Sound, and then the northern islands in southeast, Admiralty, Baranof, and Chichikov. We call those the ABC Islands. Then the next widely distributed are the black bears, and they're in the red. And you can see they don't occur up into the Brooks Range and the North Slope. They don't occur on the Seward Peninsula or the YK Delta, and not much on the Alaska Peninsula or Kodiak Island, but they occur on the mainland. You know, Kenai Peninsula, they occur on the big islands in Prince William Sound, not the ocean side islands. And then all the way down the coast, they occur on the mainland and the southern islands, Prince of Wales, and then the central islands around Petersburg. They don't occur on the ABC Islands, Admiralty, Baranof, and Chichikov. Roughly, Fish and Game's last estimate of brown bears was about 30,000 in the state, the most abundant bear population anywhere in North America for brown bears. Black bears, you know, the last estimate I saw from Fish and Game was somewhere around 100,000. That's an estimate, guesstimate. And then polar bears, somewhere on the low side of 3,500. The polar bear distribution you see on the cross-hatched area is, you know, just a little bit of the coastal plain down to the Seward Peninsula, and then the Chukchi and the Beaufort Sea populations. There are 20 distinct populations of polar bears in the world, and we have polar bears from the Beaufort Sea and the Chukchi Sea. I'll talk more about those. Let's go to the next slide. So, brown grizzly bears are the same species, but they have different distribution, and they have different behavior and habitats, which is really interesting. On the left, you have McNeil River Game Sanctuary managed by Fish and Game. Very high density bear concentration during the salmon run in the middle of the summer. On the right is Denali National Park. We call these grizzly bears, but they're one species. The technical term is brown bear, but we refer to grizzly bears as species that really aren't feeding on salmon to speak of. And, you know, Yellowstone, Glacier Park grizzly bears, you know, the Alaska Range, everything north is a grizzly bear. Just a common name, they interbreed. Next slide. So this is your first test of this class. What kind of bears are those? Just look at them for a second. Well, the one on the left is a brown bear from Admiralty Island. See the kind of the smallish ears, the big head, and the hump on the shoulders? There are a lot of black brown bears on Admiralty Island. The one on the right is actually a Kermode bear or spirit bear. It's a black bear. It's a color phase, a subspecies in central British Columbia. The point is that it's not real accurate to just look at the color and identify the bear. You need to look at some other physical traits. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, one of the best ways to identify a brown bear on the left, look at those front claws. Those are long, straight, longer than my fingers. And if you can see the black, you sort of need to be in the front. The people in the back aren't going to see this very well. But the black bear on the right has much shorter curved claws. And the thinking here is that brown bears with the big muscular on the hump on the shoulder and those big claws were adapted for digging, and brown bears are adapted for climbing. And then look at the head, the massive head on the brown bear. Proportionally, the ears look smaller. The black bear has kind of a narrower head, and the ears are proportionally, they look bigger. So just a little taxonomy. Black bears, of course, don't occur on the Alaska Peninsula or the North Slope or the Seward Peninsula. They're really more creatures of the forest. Brown bears, in contrast, are a generalist. They occur widely throughout Alaska. In fact, they occurred widely in the northern hemisphere. Eurasia, there used to be brown bears. One, two, three, one, two, three. Okay. Okay, we're back in business. So anyway, you just look at the distribution of black bears in this.
Hello.
Just make sure you hold it close to you.
Okay. Okay. Now, can you hear me? Okay. Okay, let's talk a little bit about polar bears. Polar bears are creatures of the ice, the northern sea ice. And we need to advance here. And Bob Waldrop there in the back, you probably were in the boat with me when we took that picture. We spent some time up at Kaktovik. Wonderful opportunity to photograph polar bears, which doesn't occur now. They've eliminated that opportunity. Next slide. I think there we go. Okay. Polar bears are actually really closely related to brown bears, and sometimes they hybridize, but they're really adapted to sea ice and hunting seals. Seals are a major portion of their diet. This is a ring seal at Utqiagvik, used to be Barrow. Next slide. And ring seals are the primary prey of polar bears. That's a ring seal on the upper left, a bearded seal on the lower right. Let's go ahead. Seals are full of fat, and this just helps polar bears make it through the cold Arctic winters. Next slide. So, I mentioned earlier that bears have declined substantially across the globe, and they have some unique characteristics, and I'm going to go through those. And this is why bears are vulnerable to people interactions and development, and you'll relate to this right here in Anchorage. Next slide. All bears are large-bodied and require abundant and nutritious food. Next. And because of the fact that in some portions of their range, food is not abundant, at least the high quality food. Bears go into a dormancy. I won't say winter dormancy because spectacled bears are in the southern hemisphere. And so there's some differences there. But this is a picture that ADF&G took in the den of a black bear. I've been in black bear dens where we've switched out radio collars. And you know, you can do that safely. Black bears are fairly docile. I don't know of anybody that's switched out a radio collar on a live brown bear. It sounds like not a really good idea to me. So let's go to a couple of key things with hibernation. Some people have said, well, bears don't really hibernate, ground squirrels hibernate. Well, you know, bears go into the den for about half of the year, from 5 to 7 months. They don't urinate or defecate. They recycle nitrogenous waste. Females with cubs, you know, the cubs are born in January or February, and the female lactates, so it's producing milk. Just think of that. So next slide. So this is ambient temperature on the bottom line, and then it's the bear's body temperature up on the top. And when the bears are in their winter den, their temperature declines, and it doesn't drop below 86 degrees, but that's, you know, almost about 10 degrees lower than their normal active temperature. In the summertime, it bounces up, and then there are some other things. Go ahead, next slide. Heart rate and respiration rate declines significantly when bears are denning. But I've flown in a Super Cub, you know, 200, 500 feet over the surface, monitoring the denning bears in their den with activity collars, and that airplane goes over and man, the bear's active. So bears can wake up immediately, whereas a ground squirrel, when they're hibernating, you can hold them in your hand and they're just dead to the world. So a little different situation. So you don't want to go mess around a bear den, especially a brown bear den, because you might regret it. Next slide. Okay, so this is a picture in Denali, and see the little X, the white X? Well, that's right over a bear den. And next slide. And that's a close view of a bear den. And that was about, Mary Beth went into that den, and that was about maybe 6, 7 feet dug into this slope. And you can see the tailings down below, the other picture, where the bear dug it out. And bears will dig dens, you know, every year, maybe a different den. And on Admiralty Island, we had a lot of cave denning, rock denning bears, and they didn't necessarily use the same den, but other bears would use that den. So that's kind of interesting. I don't want to get bogged down on dens. Next slide. It's really, you know, really an interesting situation. Because of the abundant food on the ice from ice seals, polar bears don't den. They're active all winter long. They've got lots of food. They need abundant, high-quality food. And only maternal polar bears, a pregnant polar bear searches out a site, digs a den into, you know, the edge of a cut bank, and snow comes over it. But most of the denning goes on in the ocean. Realize that this is going to change with climate change. So maternal polar bears go into the den and they give birth to the young, and if they were disturbed from the den and leave the den, the cubs will die. Next slide. Bob, this was at the little island off Kaktovik where they dumped the whale carcasses, and this was a polar bear that had some whale skin and blubber in its mouth. We were pretty close. We were in a boat, by the way. Next slide. I'm going to just diverge a moment and tell a quick story. We located, when I was doing my research on Admiralty and Chichagof, we located 120 dens from the airplane. And we could locate a site within an acre. And we would drop a radio collar out of the airplane, and then we'd fly in the spring when the bears went out of the dens. Well, this was late April, I had actually seen the female and her 2-year-old cub outside the den the week before. And so we flew in there with the helicopter and we're going to check out the den. And so I'm halfway into the den, you know, with my arms out. I've got my 44 in one hand and my flashlight in the other hand. And just before I hit this rock crevice cave that's opening about like that, going like that, I told Laverne Beyer, my technician and colleague, and the helicopter pilot, I said, stop. Now, you know, my heart rate is really taken off. The deal is that we saw the bears out of the den last week, but this week the radio was in the den. Beep, 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 beep. And, you know, I had this, do I really want to go in there? Well, I kind of ginned up my courage and I said, okay, slide me down. So I went down, went in through to this rock cave. It was about 8 feet long. And, you know, I was on my hands and knees. And there was a radio collar in this little nest with, you know, vegetation. That's where the bear and the cub spent the winter. And I recovered the radio and came out, measured the den, took pictures, but just a little divergent from our talk. You never know what your day is going to be like when you do this kind of work. Next slide. So most bears are omnivorous. You know, polar bears really aren't, although sometimes they do eat a little bit of grass, but you can't make a living if you're a polar bear like that. And bears move seasonally to the best food. Next slide. Bears and people concentrate their activities in the most productive habitats. Next slide. And just an example, there's upper left logging in southeast Alaska in a riparian area, the Russian River fishing on the Kenai, you're all familiar with that, the Kenai River home sites, and then interior Alaska placer mining. Well, these are areas where people concentrate in developing or home sites or recreation, but bears concentrate in those areas too. You know, that presents some serious issues for bears. Next. Characteristics. Bears are intelligent, long-lived, and learn from experience. The oldest bear we had in our study was 28 years old. That's, you know, that's getting up there for a bear. And they keep their cubs with them for 2 to 3 years. So the cubs are learning from experience. Bears are really smart. You know, anybody that's had a black bear visit them in your backyard because you had something there that, whether it's a bird feeder or whatever, you know, they're going to come back. And, you know, this is we really need to think about the intelligence and the learning from experience so that we can modify our behavior to prevent issues. Next slide. Bears are large and potentially dangerous. That goes without saying. Next. This is a real key issue. Bears have low reproductive rates. Brown bears have the lowest reproductive rate of any land mammal in North America. Next slide. Okay, this, on the lower left, we have a simple graphic starting out with a female brown bear after she was born, year 0, going through 10 years of her life. At the end of 10 years, she might be responsible for 3 bears. Herself and her 2 cubs. On the right is a deer starting out at age 0. You know, having cubs or having fawns, you know, as a yearling, and usually 2 fawns a year, and they're having fawns, and at the end of year 10, you've got 40 individuals. That's just a simple kind of comparison, but brown bears have low reproductive rates. If for whatever reason we drive brown bears down to low levels, it's very expensive and time-consuming to do good population estimates on bears. Then you can get in a jam. And next slide. And just to think back, remember that graphic of North America and showed the distribution of bears and the historic distribution, and then the little island, White Island? Well, that was Yellowstone. The Yellowstone ecosystem has less than 1,000 bears today, and keeping small, isolated populations successfully over the long time, sustaining those populations is very cost effective and challenging. So, Alaska is the last stronghold of the brown grizzly bear. That goes without saying. Next. Oh, okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. There's the distribution of brown bears in North America. The stippled area is the historic distribution. Chris Servine estimates that before 1800, there were probably, maybe 100,000 bears in North America. And today in the lower 48 states, I think there are, under 2,000 bears. So there's the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, that's Glacier Park, and then pieces of Idaho and Washington, but there are just fragmentary small populations. Going up through Canada, bears used to occur in northern Mexico, and going up through Canada and Alaska, this is really the stronghold of bears, and we have really what we started out with. Next slide. So south coastal brown bear populations are the highest density on Earth. And I'm talking Southeast Alaska, Admiralty, Baranof, Chichagof. I did mark recapture surveys on Admiralty Island, and we estimated that it was 1 bear per square mile. Admiralty is about 1,700 square miles, a lot of bears. Chichagof probably has about the same number, and Baranof probably a little bit smaller. But if you look along the coast, and you look at the Alaska Peninsula, Katmai Coast, Kodiak Island, all about the same, really high density bears. And as you move north up toward the Arctic, the number of bears becomes the density of bears becomes much smaller. Next. So let's just contrast brown bears and grizzly bears. Again, the same species. Brown bears have abundant food, small home ranges, dense populations. They're usually larger. Kodiak Island, you can have a male brown bear that's 1,200, 1,400 pounds. I think the biggest bear we had on Admiralty was about 1,000 pounds, the males. Grizzly bears, sparse food, much larger home ranges, low density populations, and the size of the bears is smaller too, but the same species. Next. Just a shot of Hallow Bay on the Katmai Coast, very high density population. Admiralty Island on the Tongass Forest in southeast Alaska, same thing. Next. So, coastal brown bear densities can be up to 80 times higher than northern or Arctic grizzly densities. That's really a phenomenal difference. So again, same species, but just different kinds of habitats, different behaviors. A Denali grizzly on the left and the Katmai brown bears on the coast there at Katmai. And I've been on the beach there, and I think we've counted 40 bears in our field of view. It's just amazing. Next. So, salmon are keystone species. That means that they have a significant impact on the ecosystem, and they drive the productivity of coastal ecosystems. You heard me say this at the first session, and I'll say it again a couple more times here. Let's go to the next. I started the brown bear research on Admiralty in 1981 and was finishing up writing papers and analyzing data when I moved to Fairbanks in 1990. That's Laverne Beyer on the left and me on the right about 40 years ago. My hair was still brown. I had more hair then too. So next. We captured bears with two methods. On the left, Laverne is setting up a snare, a leg hold snare, and we'd put these in the trails along fish streams and along the coast. And then we also captured bears from a helicopter by darting them with an immobilizing drug, which is how we caught most of the bears. Next. So, if you like boats and airplanes than doing wildlife research in Southeast or Prince William Sound or other places in Alaska. Is really a cool place to be. And I owe a debt of gratitude to my dad, who brought me up and taught me to fly and operate boats. And that was a Super Cub on our landing strip there in Hawk Inlet on Admiralty Island. Big tires, and we leased that, and that's the airplane that I used to survey and to do radio tracking of bears. And that was a boat that our family owned in partnership with Jack Lenfer, who's a pioneer polar bear biologist in Alaska. He's now living in Juneau. Next. So just very quickly, density of brown bears on Admiralty Island, 1 bear per square mile. We did that with mark recapture, census technique. Average home range size of a male bear on Admiralty was 40 square miles. A female was 14 square miles. Up in the Arctic, it's 10 times that. You know, use a much larger area, much sparser food. The bears denned at higher elevations, usually above 2,000 feet. In late April, early July, they'd move down. They'd move to the tidal estuaries where they'd be feeding on beach sedge or into the old growth forest and digging roots and skunk cabbage. Then in June, during the mating season, a lot of the bears would move up into the high alpine. And that's where we did our mark recapture survey data, where we captured bears. And then usually in mid to late June through the fish season, the bears had moved down to the salmon spawning streams. And then as the salmon declined, they'd move up slopes and look for denning sites again. Just a quick overview of the habitat use by brown bears. Next. This is actually a shot from Hallow Bay on the Katmai coast. 2 brown bears feeding on lingbai sedge. You can see those very short sedges. They didn't much use the taller grasses here. They really focused on sedges. Have a lot of nutrition in the early spring. Next. Bears are also brown bears, scavengers, black bears, predators in the early spring during calving season, fawning season. They catch newborn calves or fawns, moose caribou. They dig out ground squirrels. They eat beached marine mammals. That's walrus on the Seward Peninsula. Next. June mating season on the Katmai coast. Next. June mating season on Admiralty Island. That's where we captured the bears. Just a little side note, I've done grizzly surveys up in the Western Arctic and, of course, surveys on Admiralty and Chichikov. We could fly for 2 hours in a Super Cub and see 50 bears on Northern Admiralty Island. I have flown for 6 hours in a Super Cub and seen half a dozen bears up on the North Slope, up in the Brooks Range. Just gives you a little idea. Next. Interesting picture. This is Hallow Bay on the Katmai coast, and that's a bear trail. Isn't that cool? And sometimes the bears will just walk in the same trails. During breeding season, some of the bears will walk in the same trails, same footprint, and they'll rub their backs on trees, and we think that's kind of scent marking. I'm here, stay out of my territory. Next. Millions of salmon annually spawn in thousands of rivers and streams in southern Alaska. Next. Just a view of pink salmon spawning in Prince William Sound and sockeyes over in the Bristol Bay region. Next. Grant Hildebrand, working for Fish and Game and doing his PhD dissertation, estimated that female brown bears on the Kenai consume 2,200 pounds of salmon during summer and fall. Wow, that's pretty remarkable. Southeast Alaska riparian old growth. This is key salmon spawning habitat and key late summer bear habitat. Next. This is pretty cool. Bears are highly selective foragers. we noticed that bears preferred pink salmon on the right over chum salmon. I'm sorry, they preferred chum salmon over pink salmon. Chum salmon are bigger, they have much higher fat content than pink salmon. As the season grew on and the bears became pretty fat, they became more and more selective. They pull a salmon out and you see them step on it, and if it squirted eggs, man, they just open it up and they just tear out the eggs. If it didn't squirt eggs, they'd go on to the next one. And Scott Gendy did his PhD work at the University of Washington in Southeast looking at pink salmon, and over the course of 10 days, when pink salmon first moved into fresh water to spawn, to 10 days later, they would lose 90% of their fat content and 50% of their protein. And bears could tell the difference. If they found an old pink salmon, they wouldn't even waste their time. They'd go after the fresh, bright fish. So bears are pretty smart. And that, did I touch on that bear right there is snapping the brain case. Brains are very nutritious, and they're snapping the brain case out of that salmon. Sometimes they just take the brain. Next. Bears catch and carry salmon, depositing important marine-derived nutrients throughout the floodplain. So, for example, a female bear with cubs, she's going to run down and grab a salmon and haul ass into the woods because there are a whole bunch of bears out there, including big males, that are a threat to her and her cubs. So the bears may take salmon back 200, 300, 400 yards away from the stream, and they eat or partially eat the salmon. And of course, they're urinating and defecating, and they're putting all this marine-derived nutrients into the system. And biologists have actually measured, you can look at a nitrogen isotope and spruce trees in the beach fringe forest and even further back, and devil's club and other plants show that marine-derived nitrogen, and plants further away or without salmon coming up the spawning stream don't have that imprint. So bears are keystone species too. They're kind of like a little natural manure spreader, spreading these nutrients throughout the floodplain. And this is just amazing. And bears are really important seed dispersals. They're feeding on blueberries, and they're feeding on salmon berries and currants, and they're pooping it out. And there are a lot of berries that don't get fully digested, and they're distributed throughout the floodplain. And this is really important. Mary Wilson in Southeast Alaska, an ecologist, thinks that bears are actually more effective seed dispersers than birds in some cases. So bears play a really significant role in the ecosystem. Next. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, black bears really have the same niche as brown bears. Black bears occur on the islands south of Frederick Sound, south of the big Admiralty Baranov-Chichikov. That's Kuyu Island in the distance and Kupernoff in the foreground. Rocky Pass goes through. Lily Peacock did work on Kuyu, and she estimated bear densities there of 3.9 per square mile, the highest density ever recorded in North America. And these are big bears. I mean, they have great food resources. So black bears play a similar role. Next. So, conservation challenges. Oh, I'm doing okay here. Conservation challenges and concerns. Really, bears are like, because of those characteristics, large size, danger, low reproduction, you know, this is something that gives us a lot of concern as biologists. So let's go through. Next slide. Loss and fragmentation of intact bear habitats. Well, that's a picture ADF&G took up on the North Slope Hall Road during the pipeline, when they were building the pipeline. You notice, if you're close enough, that there's a grizzly bear in the middle of that picture, and the workers are feeding it sandwiches. Not a good idea. not a good idea, not only for those guys, but the next people that happen to be there picnicking or doing whatever, a bear's going to come up and say, hey, I want my sandwich, and no sandwich, well, tough, you know what. Then in the right side, you've got logging and road building on the Chugach Island in the Tongass National Forest. My friend and colleague, Rod Flynn, with GPS satellite telemetry, which, you know, I'm a dinosaur. I located my bears out of a little airplane, but he's got satellite telemetry going on and found that females and cubs stayed away from the riparian area and didn't have the same ability to fish for salmon in areas that had been logged like this, where the logging came right down into the riparian areas. Next slide. This is a ADF&G slide of the Yakutat dump about 50 years ago, 40 years ago. Not a good idea. Next. This is a picture I took in our neighborhood, and that bear is checking out a garbage can, and bear-proof garbage cans, as I was talking with my colleagues at Fish and Game, yeah, they're really not bear-proof. They're sort of resistant. I mean, they're better than just an old garbage can, but we really have to be careful. You really need to lock up your garbage. This is on us. I mean, we can live in harmony with bears, but we need to modify our behavior. Next. This is cool. This is 1950 aerial photo. In the middle is Campbell Airstrip, you know, Campbell Creek Science Center. And then you, on the left, you see the International Airport and this old Seward Highway. Next slide. That's 2000. Holy cow. Now, Fish and Game, at least the last estimate I saw, I think from Sean Farley, was estimating black bear numbers in the Anchorage Bowl up to Eagle River, 250 to 350. Does that make sense? And then brown bears, maybe 55 to 65 in this area. Now, you can see some corridors there, you know, down through to Westchester Lagoon and then over to the right. You know, we've got Chugach State Park, 500,000 acres, lots of bears on the hillside, and man, we've just invaded their space. And you hear people say, man, they're just, the bear population's increasing. Well, maybe our housing development's increased into bear habitat. So it's just a matter of perspective. Next slide. Many bears are killed in defense of life or property. That's legal. You have to report it to Fish and Game, and you have to take the hide off and so on. This was a Fish and Game photo in Bristol Bay. This was probably near a fish camp. Somebody shot that bear. That's a lead line around the neck, and they probably anchored it out hoping it would stay sunk, and the claws are cut off. But I suspect a lot of bears are killed needlessly in defense of life or property because people didn't use an electric fence around their chickens, or they didn't lock up their garbage. So we really need to start thinking about changing our habitats. Next slide. Small isolated populations like Yellowstone Park are vulnerable to local extirpation. And this is something that the smaller, the more isolated the population, the greater the risk. Next. In the early 90s, the Kenai brown bear population was identified by Fish and Game as a species of special concern. I wasn't working at Fish and Game at the time, but I worked closely with them on this issue, and that made sense. They're no longer identified that way, but next slide. Kenai is a small population, and it's isolated. There's not a lot of dispersal back and forth to the mainland. Another challenge is intensive management of game populations, moose and caribou, to some extent black bear in southeast, but mostly moose and caribou, where moose and caribou populations fall below a level that hunters demand, and we have an intensive management law in the state, and then Fish and Game is required to try and enhance those game populations, and one of the solutions is often predator control, which with a species like brown bear is challenging because bears have low reproductive rates. I don't think, in much of Alaska, it's so big, it's less of an issue than, say, on the Kenai Peninsula. We're going to get into second to the last session. Rick Sinnett's going to join me, and we're going to talk about this in more detail. Next slide. Climate change. Man, this is a big issue for polar bears. And 2 sessions from now, I'm going to talk about the Arctic, and we'll get into this in detail. But the climate is changing beyond a shadow of a doubt, and the ice is moving farther and farther north. And polar bears can swim. They can swim 200 miles, but cubs can't swim that far. So there are some significant issues that we're going to have to face up in the Arctic with polar bears. Next. Anything that impacts salmon is going to impact our south coastal brown bear populations, whether it's climate change or whatever it is, logging old growth forest. Salmon are really an anchor of coastal brown bears. Next. So we have an unprecedented opportunity to conserve North American bears. Next. We have, go up one more, just back one more. We have vast areas of intact habitats. This is what I talked about at our first session. We have scientific knowledge, we've got new management tools, and public interest. Next. Recognizing that polar bears are at highest risk. And they are at risk. I'll get into that when we talk about the Arctic. Next. So the question is, do we have the will, and can we invest in education of the public? That's the key. I think we have opportunities, but we need an informed public, and we need to change our behaviors. So that's all I've got. Next, last slide. And I'm happy to take any questions. Any questions? Yes.
I think you touched on it, but I maybe didn't hear it. What was the estimated overall population of the ABC island?
Well, Admiralty Island, we estimated at 1,700, and Chichgoff, probably the same, and Baranof, lots of high alpine and not as great as salmon. So I'm guessing maybe 1,000 bears or something like that. So that's a ballpark. I just don't recall the total. You can add those up. Any other questions? Yes. What do I think about bear bells? I think they're better than no bells. I actually was out on the Katmai Coast with several biologists, including Steve Herrero, who is the expert on bear attacks, and we're kind of testing out some of this stuff. And probably better than bear bells is a loud voice and, hey bear, because bear bells kind of sound like birds. So I think bear bells make sense. I think carrying bear spray makes a lot of sense. Okay, I think bear bells are okay. I think other things maybe a little more forceful might be better. And carrying bear spray is, if you're out there, is a must. I think the best defense against a bad situation with bears is right between your ears. It's thinking about avoiding high-density bear areas. We are snaring bears along fish streams. I don't recommend that. But we were there, we were working. And you can avoid those situations if you see birds like ravens, coming down and coming and concentrating. You want to get the hell out because there's probably something dead, and you're going to walk up there and a bear is going to attack you because it's defending its food, or running into a female with cubs. Those are, I think, making your presence known and avoiding places of high bear concentration are real keys. Carrying a firearm if you're proficient, a 12-gauge shotgun with buckshot, 30-06 or higher rifle. We carried rifles in our work. Fortunately, I never had to shoot a bear. I've had the safety off a couple of times. But just learning where to avoid. and using good sense.
Hmm?
Cindy, go ahead.
Oh, okay. So I was interested in the slide that said that we have scientific knowledge in ways of dealing with bears and stuff. And then I thought about how we've been killing bears to quote unquote help the caribou population west of here in the past 2 years. And but we have scientific knowledge that says that's not the problem. So why are we doing it?
This is in reference to the Mulchatna caribou
Mhm.
herd, I believe, and the predator control out there. Rick Sennett and I are going to get into that in more detail. But I think that, there's a difference of opinion. And I'm not personally an enthusiast of that project for a couple of reasons. But yeah, that's the the problem with caribou is that they have these peaks and valleys naturally. And climate change, overusing, that herd was once 200,000 and now it's around 12,000. So the habitat conditions have declined. It's a situation where it really isn't quite as simple as some people might think. But we'll get into that in more detail.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Rob.
Okay, well, yeah, you showed that picture of pipeline workers feeding the bear. And of course, everyone knows that it's important to avoid habituating bears to human food. My question is, I can't understand why the Board of Game allows bear baiting. How is that justified?
I'm not a bear baiting enthusiast. So I think it's, it does potentially habituate bears to human foods. I think we'll probably talk about this in that second to last session, but there was bear baiting on the Kenai Peninsula, and then it was the Fish and Wildlife Service rescinded that reg where they allowed it. So there's no more bear baiting on the Kenai refuge, but there is bear baiting in other portions of the state. And it's a technique that some people like. It's a technique that I don't find especially great, but we'll touch on that more later. Yes?
You mentioned that brown bears on the Kenai Peninsula were a population concern and now they're not. What sort of brought them back?
Well, yes, the question was brown bears were a population of concern listed by Fish and Game. And the state of Alaska has an endangered species list, but we don't have a threatened list. And when I was working at Fish and Game way back a long time ago, we created a species of special concern instead of a threatened species. So this was a way to be more proactive, to get a jump on having something become endangered. The state listed brown bears on the Kenai and Cook Inlet beluga whales as species of special concern. The Commissioner of Fish and Game a few years ago took the Kenai brown bear off that list. There's some disagreement between Fish and Game at the supervisory level, the commissioner or director level, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Kenai Refuge. So there has been some back and forth on that issue. But I don't believe the refuge allows bear baiting on the Kenai at this time.
So the change that you referenced and I asked about is a human label. It's not reflecting increases or
Well, when the bear was listed, there had been a very high harvest, uh, along with bear baiting and other things. I think there was a harvest that hit about 100 on the Kenai one time. That's way above sustainable levels, and that kind of precipitated that. The harvest hasn't been that high since then, so it's dropped. But that was a leadership decision to take that listing off. Other questions? Yes.
This is my own question. Can Zoomers hear me? Cindy, can you wait? Can you hear me? Maybe you could just repeat that. I was just curious how particular bears are about what they eat. I saw the gulls, coconut gulls, making around right around the bear's feet, and they didn't seem interested at all. And I don't know about other like small mammals.
Well, bears need a lot of high quality food. You see them down in the spring feeding on sedges when they're first coming out. Think of asparagus. You know, you eat the tips of asparagus. You don't eat the whole plant. And bears really get that early growth. They feed on roots, they feed on berries, and they're going after plants that have the highest energy levels and food that can help them put on fat to get through the winter. So bears are really very specific. Bears up in the Arctic or in Denali Park, you know, they probably feed on ground squirrels and peripheral kinds of things like that a lot more than bears in the temperate rainforest or in Bristol Bay, where they have higher quality foods. And they're bigger and they have more productive populations. So bears really are quite specific on what they, and you know, they know where the fish runs are and they know where the berry patches are. They've learned over time, so they go back and forth. So my colleagues at Fish and Game, I'm going to give you an opportunity if you have a thought about garbage or people in Anchorage, you know, what they can do. If you want to, I loan you the mic if you have any comments. Oh. Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming. And these folks do a really good job. I mean, just imagine managing, what, 270,000 people here with all these bears. And I think most people really like having bears, you know, in the bowl. And so thank you for the good work that you do at Fish and Game. Other questions? Yes.
Density of black bears says 3.9 per square mile. What area were you speaking to?
I was speaking to Southeast Alaska, Tongass National Forest. Those are the southern islands, kind of the central islands. It was QU Island. And Lily Peacock did research there, and that was the result of her research. Yes, Eric. Right. Well, I'll ask my colleagues here. I think this is Sean's research using hair snares. And do you know if that's still going on? Okay. Okay. Oh, no, it may not be ongoing, but we're. Yeah, I think there are a hell of a lot of bears in the Anchorage Bowl, black bears. And there are even a lot of brown bears. And I do know that Sean had some video monitors set up, and he's got pictures of people running down the trail, and then a female bear with cubs walking 10 minutes later, walking down the same trail. And you know, one example, there really are a lot of bears here. And I don't think there's any city in the United States, maybe the world, that's the size of Anchorage that has the density and amount of charismatic megafauna, big mammals, so closely allied to our living area. I mean, I have seen right in my neighborhood, we have black bears a lot. I've seen brown bears, I've seen wolverines, coyotes, and up in the Glen Alps area, wolves and brown bears and foxes and coyotes and all kinds of critters, to say nothing about the moose and the Dall sheep and all of those things. I think we're really fortunate, but we have a responsibility to manage our activities very carefully, so that we don't have them slip away like they have in so many other places. Yes? Is there an increase with the receding ice? Is there an increase on predation from polar bears on walrus? I'm not sure if I can answer that. I think that there is an increase by brown bears, by grizzly bears on walrus. And when walrus are disturbed, because they're now not on the pack ice as much and they're on land, an airplane flies over low or a snow machine or something goes by, they'll stampede. And if you're a baby walrus, that's the end of that. But polar bears mostly denned on pack ice. With receding ice, more and more polar bears are denning on land. And, from Utqiagvik all the way to the Canadian border. And the Arctic Refuge has had the greatest land denning of polar bears. And we're going to see more and more land denning of polar bears because, it's just the ice pack is changing. Yes. That's right. Yeah, it's a really good question, and I can't answer that, but I know the people that could. And I'll see if I can, pin that down in another section. But I know that the walrus that are hauling out there are facing new risk from stampeding and so on. But the ice pack is really important to a lot of species. And if you saw that article in the Anchorage Daily News about George Devokie, earlier in the week, that's a great article to read. He started his work on a little island, Cooper Island off Utqiagvik, off Barrow, 30 miles off, 50 years ago. And he was monitoring black, help me, yes, and black guillemots. He was monitoring black guillemots. And then the ice pack started receding, and all of a sudden he's getting polar bears. Now the island has a bunch of polar bears, and they're eating the black guillemots. And the black guillemots weren't doing so well because they depend on Arctic cod, and the cod were associated with ice pack, so there are a whole bunch of issues. There's just a lot of change going on right now. And we're going, and we'll have a session on this, but we're going to have to deal with development issues in the Arctic, oil and gas development. We're going to have to deal with climate change and ice, and there are just a lot of things and a lot of unknowns that we have to sort out. Yes?
You mentioned in passing photographing polar bears with Tactovic, and I had the impression that you said that there was less of that going on now. Did the community change its waste disposal practices or something?
No, I believe that the Fish and Wildlife Service and Tactovic reached a mutual agreement that they wouldn't have commercial bear viewing anymore because of the bears. Yes, the bears are still there. But I don't think there's any commercial polar bear viewing in the state that I know of. Bob or Eric, do you know? Fish and Game folks, do you know? I don't think there is. You could probably find a photographer, you know, a professional photographer, and, you know, go out with someone like that because they know special places. Yes, yes. Oh, yes, that's right. At Kaktovik, they had an island, and it was the bone pile. And that's where most of the whale carcasses would get hauled out, and the bears would come out there. And when I was up there with Bob, we saw polar bears at the bone pile, but we also saw them in other places. Some polar bears were white, and some were kind of greasy gray. Those aren't the fun ones to photograph, but they had the opportunity of the bone pile. And I also one time saw a polar bear off Point Barrow walking through the jumbled ice. That was really an amazing experience. So polar bears are, I'll cut to the Arctic issue. Hudson's Bay is probably the best place in in North America to see polar bears. Spitsbergen in Norway is another spot. But Hudson's Bay, polar bear biologists now are saying that it's likely that the polar bear will be extirpated in Hudson's Bay sometime in the 2030s because lack of ice. Okay, so we've got 5 more minutes of questions if you have any more questions. Yes.
I have another one about polar bears. Do they hunt humans? I've heard they do.
Do they what?
Hunt humans.
Y- yeah, do polar bears hunt humans? So I'm going to respond in an anecdotal way. I think at times in some of the northern villages, they have polar bear guards when the kids are walking to school to make sure that polar bears are not, you know, a danger. So I think that polar bears will take people. Black bears sometimes do that. But you know, it's as polar bears are more and more on land and not out on the ice pack, we can probably, just like brown bears and black bears, we can probably expect more issues in terms of safety and getting into garbage and all of those kinds of things. But, you know, just one brief comment. You know, the rule of thumb, if you're attacked by a bear, lay down and roll into a ball and protect your neck and head. That's for a brown bear or a grizzly bear. You don't want to do that with a black bear because sometimes, very, very rarely, black bears will hunt a person, take a person. And what you want, the rule of thumb from the experts is to pick up a log, pick up a rock, and just fight like hell. And you don't want to do that with a brown bear or a grizzly bear. But so being able to identify a bear and kind of sort out your odds is a good thing. But you know, the chances of having a serious impact with bears is very, very low. Lower than getting killed by a dog. So anyway, fishing game folks, any comments? Okay, thanks. I think we're on track with what we've been saying. Short way. Yes.
Kind of a natural history question. You mentioned that polar bears and brown bears can sometimes intermate and produce viable offspring. How long ago did those two, you know, species sort of go their separate ways, and has it been correlated with ice ages and so on?
Yeah, yeah. That's how long have polar bears and brown bears been separated, or how long did they diverge from a common ancestor? That's part of the question. And you know, they do hybridize. We're seeing a little bit more and more of that as polar bears and brown bears come together on land. So hybridization is occurring. If I remember correctly, I mean, I've got it written down somewhere, but I think it may be about 500,000 years that polar bears and brown bears diverged. So it's been a while. And I don't want to cut into next week's thing, but Southeast Alaska, the ABC Islands, it's not a subspecies, but they are closely allied with polar bears. And I'll talk a little bit more about that then. But it's interesting. And then Baranof and Chichagof are, you know, it's a hop, skip, and a jump through Peril Strait to get to the other island. They're genetically distinct from Admiralty Island. And Admiralty Island, you know, has, there's a good number of black brown bears. You know, I showed that slide. But the ABC Islands, northern Southeast Alaska, is not a subspecies, but it's really genetically distinct. And they're closely allied to polar bears, way back. One thought maybe is that there was a relic population of polar bears after the Ice Age, a kind of a refugee effect. And of course they disappeared, but as brown bears came to the islands, they hybridized. But there's a very distinct genetic difference between the ABC Islands and the other islands. And of course, Kodiak Island is a separate subspecies of brown bear. It's been isolated. And then the black bear, there are 3 subspecies. The one in northern Alaska that goes across Canada and the US, and then in Southeast Alaska, there's a subspecies. And then from Glacier Bay to Cordova, there's a distinct subspecies. And that's called the glacier bear, because a few of those bears have kind of a silver blue coat. So just some bear trivia. Anything else? Any other questions? As we break up, I'm happy to talk to people individually if you want. So thank you very much.